Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Good evening. I thank you for your interest, and today we will conclude this series of lectures on the relationship between communication and power in the network society by focusing on the second part of my analysis on the role of social movements in the transformation of power relationships in the age of the Internet, and particularly trying to understand the specificity of social movements and social mobilization in general in a digital environment. Let me start by trying to elaborate on what is this transformation, the relationship between social mobilization in the Internet age. That it can take similar forms, technologically and organizationally, and yet be very different in processes and goals. But all social mobilization processes in our time start in the Internet social networking space. They connect with personal social networks, online and offline, and they breathe with life by moving into the urban space and forming local communities that express themselves in their webs and connect with each other in the Internet-based global networks. So in the information age, in our age, from now on, all social mobilizations will have a fundamental Internet component. So this is not normative, this is purely descriptive. But this is, therefore, this is not what is distinctive. The fact that social mobilization is in the Internet, all social mobilizations take place in the Internet. What is to be investigated is how this digital networking forms shapes that are different kinds of social movements. For instance, allowing collective action without a command and control center. In other words, what we have to understand is not if the Internet is in this particular process. If it is, it will be. But which are the specific effects of being in the Internet or being these social networks organized around Internet networks. But at the same time, there are very different kinds of social mobilization depending on the goals of the movement and on the processes and outcomes of the movement. In my conceptualization, I always differentiated before the Internet age, between demand movements, which are focused on a particular demand within the institutional system, such as obtaining better working conditions, negotiating a salary, obtaining housing rights, or equal rights for women. And this is different from what I call political insurgency, which this is the formation of instant communities of practice, or more specifically, is their processes of conscious collective action aimed at the transformation of the state from outside the institutional channels defined by a given state. But they are aiming at transforming political institutions, although not necessarily at seizing power by themselves, but to create a more democratic system, for instance, or a less democratic system. So, therefore, demand movements, political insurgency movements, which are movements focused on the transformation of politics, of institutional politics, but from outside the channels of set up for the transformation, for instance, outside elections, although they may have impact on the elections. And then a third type is social movements, which are conscious collective actions that aim at transforming the values and norms of society at large, such as, for instance, the women's movement against patriarchalism or the environmental movement aiming at constructing a new relationship between culture and nature, or the movements to abolish financial capitalism, or the movements to create a new form, entirely new form of democracy. Now, in fact, the three types, which are conceptually different and has consequences about the different, the three types in practice, they mix all the time. But it's very important, and it actually becomes a critical, both theoretical and practical question, how you move from one type to another, how you connect specific demands with political insurgency with social movements, and so on. Usually, social movements are at the source of the main processes of social transformation because, as I tried to argue in my first lecture, the fundamental changes in power relationships start with the transformation of people's minds, with the values and norms and beliefs that people have. And that's what social movements aim at, is that for women, for instance, for women to see themselves as different than had been seen in the patriarchal society throughout history. So, therefore, the movements that I will analyze here today are fundamentally they are social movements aiming at to change changing the values and norms of society, but they combine with other movements. The movements I analyze, the Arab revolutions that I analyzed last lecture, are much closer to political insurgency movements, although also have aspects of social movements. I will try to provide some empirical basis to our analytical discussion by report and specific analysis of two major social movements which are unfolding: the indignance movement in Spain and the Occupy Wall Street movement in the United States. There are many other such social movements going on in the world. There are many, many Occupy movements in the world. At the last count, there are about 2,400 occupied public spaces in the world connected in the web. And this is growing by the day. And some of the movements are extremely significant, like the Greek movement in this moment, which may be in part the response to the technocratic policies to reform the euro without people's consent. But I would argue that the Spanish indigenous movement was the first major movement that started to transform the values of a given society last year, with the exception, I mentioned in my first lecture, of the Icelandic movement. Iceland was the pioneer of all these kind of movements in 2009, 2010. But still, after the Arab revolutions, the world started to accept something that we knew for some time, both in theory and in practice, that new forms of social mobilization have developed, and the digital networks were absolutely crucial. So the initial reaction was, yes, but this is for the Arabs, because this is for dictatorships. In Europe or in the United States, we don't need that. We have institutional channels for this kind of social movements. Well, in fact, in my analysis published in my book, Communication Power, I showed the critical role of internet and autonomous social networks in the success of the Obama campaign, which was, in my terminology, a political insurgency movement, because it came from completely outside the core of the Democratic Party to propel to the presidency of the United States a most unlikely candidate. And that was, at that time, very much a political insurgency movement. And I have documented and analyzed and produced a number of writings on the matter. Yes, but different to be completely outside the system as social movements built autonomously against all political parties and in some cases even trade unions from outside the socio-political system. So this is what I want to try to summarize today for you, and then to draw some analytical conclusions about the characteristics and the relevance of this movement. Regardless of the tone, all this is not normative. I'm not saying that the movements are good, bad, democratic, not democratic. I'm trying to simply, and I'm not trying to argue with anyone about the need for a new polity. I'm simply saying, for a large majority of the public opinion throughout the world, the current political system is dysfunctional. 2/3 of citizens in the United States, Europe, and in other areas of the world consider they are not represented by the representatives. Okay? So there is a massive crisis of political legitimacy. And what we are seeing is the emergence of new forms of social movements with, to express goals, desire for change, transformation, in a very confusing way, which clearly are not processed by the political system. And I compare to some extent to what happened in Europe at the end of the 19th century, when liberal parties were not able to express, because they were kind of the more progressive wing of the traditional interests of the nascent bourgeois society, but they were not taking care, by and large, of the demands of a new social movement, of the working class movement, which had different political ideologies and representation: anarchists, Fabian in the case of England, socialists in broader sense, who did not have a political expression until a long, long time. So what happened is that over time, these social movements, these new social movements coming from the industrial society, pushed away the, let's say, the social change-oriented wing of the political system, which ultimately was weakened decisively and ultimately semi-disappeared in many countries. This is for one simple reason. In political terms, the conservative right is always the same, basically. Changes name, changes parties, but doesn't change the fundamental role, which is to express, by and large, the interests of the dominant social groups of the society, not only classes, but traditional ideologies, family values, etc. While the so-called left, let's say, the forces that within the political system try to work for social change in a given context, depend entirely on their ability to express the desire and the need for change existing in civil society at large. So the moment the so-called left of any given system, which I like about right and left, is purely geometric. It's one, you don't have to say the left is forever. No, which left? Under which conditions? What has been left in one century is not left in another, and so on. So the moment there is a disconnection between the political actors that supposedly have to act for the transformation of some elements of the social order, and the society pushing for that social order, that left is sentenced. And this is exactly what's happening in the world today, by and large. The last act was yesterday in Spain, where basically the Spanish Socialist Party received a blow that probably will never recover again. Now, talking about the indigenous movement in Spain, one word about the context. Contexts are always important to analyze social movements, fundamental. But contexts do not explain the social movement. From the same context, many different movements can emerge. So we have to go into the specificity. In other words, in the famous thing about the structure and agency, what is the most important thing? Agency, no question about it. Because agency is what actually acts in society and what actually moves and shapes society. So structure is very fundamental to see which kind of agency is going to be constituted. But ultimately, what really happens as a social process, will reform, change the existing structure, will move into a new structure, and will be able to either reproduce or produce a new social system. But it's still important to remind all of you what is this context, and that's very simple. The context of the indigenous movement in Spain is, of course, the structural crisis of financial capitalism that has been one of my recent themes of research that I presented exactly in this same room about a year ago, following by a movie show that the Los Angeles influence on my work at this point. So this crisis of financial capitalism, which I will not repeat today, but we can discuss if you're interested, includes also the emergence of alternative economic cultures, which presented in my film last year. And these alternative economic cultures are one of the elements that have given birth to the indigenous movement in Spain. So it's not only a socio-political movement, it's also the expression of a desire to live in different terms, to live under different conditions of the current financial capitalism. Movements in Europe have emerged around the crisis in different forms. In Greece, Portugal, Germany, Italy, the UK, against cuts of welfare state, criticism of the banks, and criticism of the political class that does not provide answers and perpetuates the close connection between the financial system, the political class, and the media system, which is the key triangle of power in our societies, as I tried to argue. Under these conditions, it's a huge crisis of legitimacy. This is not simply against a movement or movements against the economic crisis. These are movements against a non-working democracy and against a way of life vaguely identified as capitalism. Again, this is simply descriptive. This is the kind of movement. Movements say, we don't like it, and at the same time, we don't see any political representation that can actually help in changing the situation. In most cases, like in the Spanish movement, people see it not as a crisis, but as the necessary consequence of a system based on financial speculation and lack of political accountability. I like to repeat what I said in the first lecture, something that describes what the Spanish movement is about. It's a banner, one of the most famous banners in the movement, saying, "It is not a crisis, it is that I do not love you any longer." Now, why the indigenous movement? Well, by the way, the analysis of the indigenous movement is based on my own field work directly with my own researchers in my group in the Institute in Barcelona, but this is what I have done personally. Why indigenous? The name comes from a pamphlet, as some of you may know, from a 93-year-old French philosopher, respected philosopher, Stephane Hessel, that no one in the movement knew before. But he wrote a 40-pages pamphlet. I would say it's the greatest intellectual work you ever saw. And that, for me, shows that the relevance of an intellectual work, he's a serious philosopher, he wrote an intellectual piece of work, and had more influence than any other philosopher in the last 10 years. Why? Because it struck a chord and did it in very simple terms and did it from no political ideology, no political perspective, saying, look, guys, this is going on. Are you going to do something about it? Can't you let it go like this? And you know, in the Spanish movement, how they call Stephane Hessel, not the leader, the tender grandpa. And again, grandfather. The movement started, I will give you a little bit more of description of the Spanish movement, while I will give you just some data with not describing them verbally on the American movement, because it's, interestingly enough, the Spanish movement, which really has been the source of all these other movements, for a long time was ignored by the international press. Was not about bullfights, was not about any drama about socialists, and therefore was ignored, was kind of something linked to Spain and not to the rest. It started in February 2011 with a small group in Madrid, and we then branched out to other places, in particular to Barcelona, that formed a small group called Real Democracy Now. Both meeting face-to-face, but also on the internet. First of all, it's a non-partisan political movement. Doesn't attack or criticize any party, just doesn't care about political parties. Just does not consider political parties are relevant into this. And what started was the idea that on May 22nd, 2011, were municipal elections coming up in Spain, and they wanted to intervene in the debate of these political elections. Then, during the electoral campaign that lasted about 2 weeks, it became clear that at the time of a fundamental crisis in Spain, in which there is currently over 21% unemployment and 45% youth unemployment, and possible collapse of the Spanish public debt and the Spanish economy anytime, under such conditions, with almost 5.5 million people out of job, on long-term unemployment, under such conditions, politicians in the municipal elections were again using the election to kill each other, to blame each other, to see who could win, under which condition, little reference to the crisis in very generic terms, and always to fault the other party, the other leader, etc. So this movement just again struck a chord, like Hessel had done, saying, well, enough is enough. We are going to end all this politicking and empty discourses, and let's call for a demonstration on May 15th, one day before the election, to say, no, go to hell. There's no way that we are going to take this anymore. We don't know exactly how and under which conditions, but this is not something that is going to represent us, take us out of the crisis, create jobs for the young people, or even to build any alternative form of life in the kind of life that we are having today. It was actually also aggravated by the lies from the socialist government. That's why they paid in the crisis. For 2 years, the president of the government, Felipe Rodríguez Zapatero, had been saying, there's no crisis. Which crisis? There's no crisis. Literally. And then after that, they started to say, well, there is a crisis, but it's going to go away. And then suddenly, in May, precisely in May 2010, 1 year earlier, Merkel, Sarkozy, and Obama called him and said, look, guy, your economy is collapsing. It's the 10th largest economy of the world. No way. You are going to do this and this and this and this and this and this. And they sent him this letter that was then leaked to the press and is published, a series of measures that Zapatero had to immediately implement. So Spain was, let's say, under economic intervention from the major powers in Europe and in the world. And that's what really has sentenced the Socialist Party, because after saying no crisis, then suddenly changed completely, started to implement dramatic budget cuts that make Cameron to be to appear as a moderate compared with the social benefits cuts, etc., with no explanation. And lately even Merkel called him and said, oh, well, and in addition, now you have to change the constitution in 2 days to introduce a new constitutional article saying that Spain cannot indebt itself, with Zapatero obliged in 2 days, at the end of August, when no one was in the parliament. Okay, so now you start understanding a little bit the crisis of legitimacy. Not only in Spain, in the world, because it's similar behavior everywhere. So at the end, on May 15, there was a huge demonstration, unexpectedly, no unions, no parties, no nothing, on the internet, Real Democracy Now. Nobody knew who these Real Democracy Now people were. I know very well some of them. There's a bunch of friends, nothing else. Some had been politically active in some groups, but no, not at all anymore. So about 60,000 people showed up in Madrid, 40,000 in Barcelona, tens of thousands in other places in Spain, protesting against the emptiness of politics. That's it, no, nothing else. And against the crisis and against everything. At the end of the demonstration, and this we know exactly because we know exactly the people, at the end of the demonstration in Madrid, about 30 people decided to sleep in the main square of the city of Madrid. No tent, no nothing. Simply there to talk about what to do now. So that's what then merely was called, okay, let's occupy. Occupy is simply people sitting in one public space, seeing together what to do next. And then they call Barcelona as well. In Barcelona, the following day, not the first day, then 20 people, 20 only, went again to the main square of Barcelona and started to discuss. And then they brought some sleeping bags, and then at the end of the meeting, they started to tweet friends. Then friends came. The following day, there were hundreds, started to tweet friends. And then the following day were thousands. So in 3 days, with no indication, no instruction, no nothing, thousands and thousands of people started to converge into the main squares of Spain. Now, most of them did not sleep in the public pavement. Why? It's hard. I didn't, even if I was observing all the things. It's very hard. You need to have young bones in addition, and that was nice weather. Talk to the Occupy New York people. This is a different matter. So, but the main thing was to occupy, to mark symbolically the togetherness. Immediately in the main square of Catalonia was renamed Tahrir Square. Interesting enough, we'll come to this later, the first space occupied in New York, Zuccotti Park, was immediately renamed Tahrir Square. So it's a conscious relationship between movements, conscious, direct. Now, the explicit goals of the Spanish movement were to denounce false democracy that had been captured by bureaucracy of parties, to propose another forms of politics and democracy, which is not against representative democracy, is the whole series of things, accountable parties, reform of the electoral law, reform of finance, is very practical political reform movement, control of banks, regulation of financial system, tax the banks, tax the bankers, and end of adjustment policies and austerity policies, control of political corruption, new forms of job work, of job creation, sharing jobs, providing new forms of housing for youth, stimulating agroecological development, asserting women's rights, and go on and on and on. A whole series of demands. Now, but the most important was the process that how all these demands came about. The process was always based on assemblies. Assemblies in the street, in the square, open deliberation in these assemblies, and voting at the end of the assembly, on different issues. And then on the basis of the vote, formation of commissions to implement the decisions of the assembly. No formal leadership, coordination within one particular encampment and throughout the country and throughout the world over the internet. But decision-making was retained in the General Assembly every day at the end of the day. And how was designated the Assembly? Simply those who were there, period. Those who were there had the right to vote, and those who were not there would come the following day. And every day, a decision could be reversed by the following day. Okay? So the square in Barcelona, in Madrid, everywhere, became a community, an instant community to experiment together and to overcome fear together. Important, moderators, you still need to moderate such a debate, 2,000 people, 3,000 people. Moderators rotate all the time. And one of my questions to some of the leaders was, okay, but you are moderator, then that's the beginning of leadership. The beginning you can manipulate the assembly, say, oh no, After 2 hours of moderating such an assembly, you just want to get out and to have another moderator. No leader will survive more than 3 assemblies to be moderated. So nothing was organized in terms of formal leadership. And yet the movement made progress every day. It's stable. Today, started in May. We are November. Does not disintegrate, grows. Very important, no spokespersons, no spokespersons. The media were going crazy when they wanted to speak with someone. Say, well, no sé, find someone. And when they found one person willing to talk, to, okay, so you represent the views of the movement? No, I represent myself, period. So, but can you say on behalf? No, on behalf of myself. You are not interested, talk to someone else. Media first ignored the movement completely, then became openly hostile. And I will come more on this. Not the journalists, and this is also the same thing that happened in Europe, not the journalists. The journalists were very interested. As soon as they would get back to their TV station, to the radio program, to their newspaper, immediate censorship from the editors. No, this movement is, we don't know who they are, manipulators, probably violent, out. We have to show all the dangers of this movement. In the encampment, no alcohol, no drugs, but had to be by conviction, not by imposition. This is a movement in which nothing is imposed. If you really want to get drunk anyway, they look bad at you, but it's not, you can do it. But it was minimal. For a long time it was minimal until street people who are already drug addicts, who are already drunken, started to use the encampment to sleep there in safer conditions than in the street in terms of police harassment. A fundamental principle, which is still debated, is never settled, but a fundamental principle accepted in every assembly every day was non-violence. That was fundamental, very clear, non-violence. Now it's easy to say non-violence in abstract. It's much more complicated when the movement decided not to respond to violence from the police with violence. That is the non-violence. It's not to be nice. The non-violence is they hit you, you don't hit back. Finally, the municipal elections of May 22nd came. The movement abstained from any position, no political partisanship, no ideology, not even anarchism. It's the most anarchist movement is the one that is not even anarchist, you understand? All was about individual decisions. Was, of course, a catastrophe for the socialists already there, lost 40% of their votes, most of them to abstention or nullified. The same thing again happened yesterday. Socialist coalition, socialists absolutely collapsed, but that was already coming, was clearly seen coming. But then in terms of the process of the movement, after 12 days of the encampment in Barcelona, that was in Barcelona, although the movement was all over, but after 12 days, well, the people were still discussing, debating what to do quietly. Then the Catalan police in an early morning attacked the encampment where about 600 people were sleeping, with the same pretext that is being used everywhere in the world, to clean the place. Healthy conditions, hygienic conditions. These people are dirty, so you have to clean the place. Of course, there was one of the commitments of the movement, at least in Barcelona that I could observe, is to clean the place. So everything was very clean, in fact, because they were living there. But the police attacked in the early morning. I was there. There was no violent response. Media journalists immediately came up. They were beaten up. So what people did was to sit down, facing the police, to protect the encampment, sitting down quietly and holding hands together. So the police started to club them. As soon as one would fall, bloodied, another one would come and be there. It's like the Gandhi movie. For 6 hours. For 6 hours. Of course, finally they threw them out of the square, but the media reporting, in that case, anytime there is blood, media report immediately. Beating, clubbing, bloodied people, cries, desperate people running around, then you have report. And that immediately prompted a huge response. And in the afternoon, there were 30,000 people around the encampment. And at that point, you start shooting or you let it go, which is what didn't happen a year later. There were not 30,000, there were 2,000, and that's a big difference. Anyway, so the encampment was restated, but the non-violent principle was affirmed. After that, the first poll taken in early June in Spain, 81% of the population of Spain thought that the indignants were right and they treated the real problems of the country. 51% considered that parties only care about themselves and not about the people. 70% do not support any party. And 90% think that party must change. Of those supporting the movement, 78% had voted socialist, but 46% had voted conservative. So it was across political ideologies. As a way to, but the critical moment came when the movement in Barcelona decided to be more offensive, not just stay there talking. They decided to block the Catalan parliament the day the Catalan parliament would discuss and approve the austerity measures for the budget crisis. That was June 15th. So 2,000 demonstrators blocked the parliament and insulted the deputies that were trying to go through and threw a little paint on some of their clothing. That's it. But then immediately the police started to club them, and there was some very small incidents. 20 of them were arrested and they are being judged. But immediately all political parties condemned this blocking of the parliament as an assault on representative democracy and as a fascist attitude that showed the real ideology of the movement. There was a media barrage without proportion with the incidents, and at that point, I remember we had a meeting with my team. We decided to start closing the research report with the chapter on the end of the movement out of this uncontrolled situation. Well, no. The movement was able to explain that they had been provoked, that they were against any violence or anything. And then 4 days later, when the movement was supposed to be buried, all over Spain, and particularly in Barcelona, huge demonstrations took place, hundreds of thousands, the largest demonstrations since for many years, and the largest one ever without unions or parties being present or sponsoring. Autonomous demonstration. That was the most important issue. No incidents in any of these demonstrations, no incidents. So the movement regained the favor of the public opinion. Then everybody said, well, as Lenin said, during summertime, students go home and revolution stops. But the movement actually kept being very active during the summer. They organized a march on Madrid from all over Spain on July 25th. Hundreds walk by foot from all cities to Madrid, and then they were welcomed in Madrid by tens of thousands who went comfortably by train. And then they engaged in specific campaigns at the local level. They decided to lift the encampments. Were not necessary anymore. Was a problem with people, homeless, street people coming more and more. So they decided that they could not stay in the encampments forever, so they left it, but they organized assemblies in the neighborhood and a series of actions, such as a European march on Brussels in September, and then they started to prepare in early September, together with other groups from other countries, that they had formed a network formed named Real Democracy Now International. So it's like looks like an affiliated company, but in fact was simply a network of the people who were thinking about the same thing. And they team up with another network called Take the Square, and they organized a meeting in early September in Barcelona to try to globalize the struggle. To globalize the struggle, they proposed to organize a global demonstration on October 15th on the notion united, the slogan was united for global change. But everybody then would add whatever they wanted in every place, in every city. As you know, this United for Global Change movement on October 15th actually brought to the streets over 700,000 people in 80 cities around the world with no organization, no central leadership, and no program. Each one had his own program. Interestingly enough, one last empirical description, in July, a Canadian journal based in Vancouver, Adbuster, specialized in the criticism of commercial advertising, decided to launch a call for Occupy Wall Street. And that first idea was taken in a Madrid meeting on July 25th with other people who were there from the rest of Europe and the United States, and together they decided that 17th of September would be the day to occupy Wall Street, and that the rest of the world should start preparing actions of support exactly for September 17th. So that's how the movement started in Canada, was actually thought and debated in Madrid first, and then, as I will tell you in a moment, was taken up in the United States. Key characteristics of the Spanish indigenous movement. I want to proceed by description, then some analytical characteristics, and we'll go into the conclusions later on. Again, no leaders, no program from outside the movement, all debated and organized and decided in general assemblies, explicit refusal of political leadership or ideology. But it's primarily political. Primarily political. The key thing is they, the politicians, do not represent us. We want real democracy. That was the key. It develops in the context that I mentioned. It also develops on the basis of alternative cultures, largely ecological in terms of meaning of life, which have major support, at least in Barcelona, according to my research on the matter. It starts over the internet, but establishes permanent connections between internet, wireless, encampments, and demonstrations. Two major themes from the very beginning. The crisis should be paid by the banks, not by the people, and politicians do not represent us. The two major themes that have been repeated. The movement elaborated in all these meetings alternative proposals of political reforms and economic policies, including nationalization of the banks, condonation of mortgage debts, and regulation of finance. But the programs are very diverse and are elaborated and revised by every assembly that is sovereign in its own locality. Many other groups joined in September with their own agendas, particularly workers from the public sector unions, but organized in collectives, not formally organized by the unions. They started a very large campaign, which still goes on, of direct action against victims of the evictions of housing, blocking actually hundreds of these evictions. And they started to occupy everything they could with the specific demands, so that any occupation would be a focal point for the demands. And they developed alternative media, aware of media impact, in order to generate its own information and video over the internet. About the elections, anyone is free to participate, but no enthusiasm until an electoral reform makes possible to make a difference through elections. In social terms, in terms of the social composition, it started with youth college educated people. But people from all ages, genders, and conditions joined later, particularly many retired people, many old people, and a strong participation of women. We know that the movement had no leaders, but I would say if anyone has an idea about who really leads the movement, it's always quite systematically women, middle-aged women, meaning 30. Political parties started to pay attention, although they tried to cancel the camps and evict people. But there was a huge political marketing strategy saying, sure, we understand you, particularly the socialists went out of their way to say, sure, we really understand you. We are going now, we understood, Please vote for us and you will be safe by us. Of course, they were crushed forever. As for the vision of themselves, two things are critical in my interviews. And I cite, everybody can make mistakes, and we will make mistakes, but we will not pay for the mistakes of those who created the crisis. Our mistakes is okay, we'll assume and we'll change it, but not for other people's mistakes. And second, which is what is there, we go slow because we go far. That's critical. They have an acute consciousness of history making, of not necessarily winning in the short term, not necessarily succeeding in most of their structural demands. Just they have an absolutely clear consciousness. And I'm not saying they are right. I'm saying they think, for me social movements are defined by social movements, not from the outside the social movement. And they really see themselves as the beginning of something very big. They don't know what, but something that is going to change the world. They have a conscience and a pride of changing the world. Parties do not dare to criticize openly some of the right-wing elements of the Conservative Party, particularly Aznar, they did, but fundamentally the parties are not openly opposed, but they will now. After the elections are passed, now it's clear that the party will have a different moment. So in my observation, this is a deep movement that is reinventing politics or wants to reinvent politics. They are not about outcome, they are about process, because they have learned from the mistakes of the anti-globalization movement that collapsed because of that. The wrong questions to address to this movement is who's leader, which organization, which program. Well, these are the wrong questions, not the question that the movement itself raises for itself. They invent ad hoc organizations for each moment and for each task. And the coordination and the debate and collective decision-making, they have the internet. And so that's why the assembly model becomes materially possible now. They have the internet. Furthermore, since the key is to learn by doing and to overcome fear, internet allows permanent togetherness, which is critical. They always say, together we can. An important matter here in terms of the lack of program, lack of precision in the program, is to relate to some of the discussions and debate that have taken place on social change and social movement these last years. And there are three elements I want to cite. It's interesting. Three different women working independently have converged toward the same point. Simonetta Taboni, an Italian sociologist, wrote a very brilliant analysis about the value of ambivalence in promoting social change. In other words, when you are ambivalent in your programs, in your proposals, etc., many people can bring in with their own meaning. People can project their meaning on this ambivalence, and therefore has much greater appeal. Much greater appeal. Ruth Cardoso wrote a brilliant essay, title says everything. The people disunited will never be vanquished. The people disunited will never be vanquished. Why? Because you are not going to be united ever representing the diversity of the people. That was the old notion of the party who would have a program that would bring everybody together as a unified social movement. You plan the program, you deploy the banner, you march in battalions, and everything is together. And of course, everything, one, is usually defeated because it's very easy to see the target, and second, is also necessarily a minority movement, because you cannot have a wide range of society behind the movement. Given the diversity of society, you fix that society in one particular point. And Isidora Chacon, another sociologist, wrote that uncertainty is a fundamental lever of social change, because certainty means that you already have to fix yourself on a given target, which by definition will never really happen, because the more you do, the more things change. So what was certain is going to be uncertain. So, but uncertainty, managing uncertainty within a movement, allows the movement to be flexible, to be adaptable, and to be constantly reprogrammed and rediscussed and rebooted on the internet all the time. So against the traditional forms of politics based on battalions, certainty, united, non-ambiguity, this flexibility of letting the movement develop organically, bringing in whoever wants to bring in his own projects, oppressions, desires. This is what creates a movement that has a huge political legitimacy. How much? In Spain, at this point, after all these dramas I told you, 73% of Spaniards support the values, the goals of the movement. 73%, according to the latest data from Metropolitics, the leading Spanish opinion institute, of which 20% said they had actually followed the movement in the internet, and 9% say they have actually participated in demonstrations. 9% of a 45 million country population. Okay, so there is a crisis, and there is renewal. It's still uncertain, but what is certain is nothing again will be the same in Spain or in Europe for that matter. Few words, have 10 minutes, on Occupy Wall Street, not to lose time in empirical detail. I did empirical detail on Spain because of what I mentioned, that is much less known. But you had Occupy Wall Street, it's constantly taking place. So you can start. Where I will be talking will be a timeline of the main events on the Occupy Wall Street movement that you can follow there. Every slide is 30 seconds. So, and you can follow the sequence of events while I concentrate on the analytical elements of the analysis. Well, the context for Occupy Wall Street is exactly the same. It's a major lasting economic crisis. It's the outrage with financial bailouts and executive privileges, is social inequality. 1% of American households control 20% of the wealth of the country. There is a crisis of political legitimacy, which was not a year ago, but Obama just failed the whole thing by one simple thing. He could make many political mistakes, but what the movement does not forgive Obama for is to appoint to the key positions of the cabinet, again, Wall Street, leading Wall Street people. The same thing that Clinton did, the same thing that Bush did, and in fact many of the Obama appointees were Clinton bees. Adbuster started with a call on the internet by itself, no connection, no organization, no nothing, in July calling for September 17th, because September 17th is the day of the American Constitution, and the main target was to demonstrate against the connection between money and politics. The movement attracted immediately alliances with the labor unions, particularly with public sector labor unions and other collectives, but most of the people joining were individually mobilized. It was ignored or falsified by the mainstream media for a long time, even after it showed its resilience and occupied New York in the middle of the snowstorm. And then they have been recently declared dead after the eviction of the movement from Zuccotti Park. Yet, even the latest data show that for 46% of Americans, the 99% movement reflects the views of most Americans. Only 30% disagree with that. So still, there is a significant proportion, and in fact more people than of the contrary view, that support the goals of the movement. It evolved from the simply Occupy Wall Street to what their main self-denomination now, the 99% movement, which it really means we want to be everybody. We are all together in this. Again, you remember, no specific program, no the workers, no the women, no the socialists, no, the people who are the people, and who are those, anyone who is part of the 99% should and could be in the movement. Which, by the way, in one of the first demonstrations, when they were demonstrating in Wall Street, the managers and executives in the Wall Street financial firms appear in the balconies of Wall Street dining with champagne and with the title, "We are the 1%. So it's really a class consciousness and on that side, not on the movement side. What all these things of all the demands in the movement have in common is that people have been affected in different ways by the same system. It is the system that is not working, not specific people or specific policies. Critical on the movement is that they are instant, they support the spark of indignation, and they also clearly from the beginning is a movement that is local and global. It's a movement that also called Zuccotti Park Tahrir Square at the beginning. It's a movement that connected to the Spanish movement. It's a movement that has been connected through a network of cities that together were organizing the October 15th demonstration. Important, they cannot be really controlled because they have no center and they constantly reconfigure the networks. So technologically and organizationally are impossible to suppress. You can club them, you can attack them, you can arrest them, but you cannot destroy something that does not exist as an organized movement, that keeps growing and growing and growing. They immediately form a public space and they create deliberation. Deliberation is the fundamental goal for the movement. Deliberate about what to do, what's going to be next, empowering themselves. They are proposing the creation of a people's virtual assembly that could accommodate the participation of all those who want to collaborate. And immediately every occupied space generates a web that connects in a network of webs. In some cases, there is even occupation in one street, and the occupation of universities. I was 2 weeks ago at Cambridge, Massachusetts, the day Harvard was occupied, and everybody was shocked at the existence of an Occupy Harvard movement. Berkeley was occupied, that apparently is more understandable, but in fact, Berkeley had not had the same operation, and in fact, originally, Berkeley used the police to evict the encampment. The response had been 12,000 people in the Berkeley campus that have reinstated the encampment. Critical in this movement, as in all, but particularly in America, is the relationship to the media, because the relationship to the media is the key to connect the movement with the population at large. That is the fundamental thing. Now, the media had been systematically hostile. Not the journalists, but the journalists increasingly are in contradiction with their editors and their owners. In the case of New York, 26 journalists had been beaten and arrested by the New York police in the last demonstration. But still, the movement has been constantly depicted as marginal and declared dead. Particularly the editorialists, the opinion leaders of the New York press and the media constantly downplay the importance of the movement, constantly refer to the danger for democracy, and there is a huge curtain of first silence and then falsification, empirically speaking, about the goals of the movement and the practice of the movement. What the movement is trying to do is to connect to society through the internet, particularly through the power of images, YouTube. You can talk, but if you have any spectacular initiatives, they are being helped by Meet On, a major organization with thousands and thousands of followers, or by Change.org, another organization which was created during the Obama campaign, and which constantly produces images, videos throughout the internet showing different initiatives of the movement. Like recently, last week, started a Occupy Highway movement to protest against energy and highway policies that are currently marching from New York to Washington, D.C., because tomorrow the Senate Committee on Energy has to decide on the energy policy of the United States. So a group of quite courageous people are walking through the freeway from New York to Washington to arrive tomorrow there. And they are followed by camera, they are followed by people who are broadcasting live over the internet, etc. So let me then conclude by emphasizing some of the characteristics of this movement in the context of a broader theory of social change. Social change involves an action, individual or collective, that at its source is motivated emotionally, as all human behavior, as Antonio Damasio has demonstrated empirically again and again. It is not your excitement about a new program for housing policy. It's your emotion first, and then you go into the rest. There is a very important stream of research in political science lately that has come to be known as the theory of affective intelligence, that brings together neuroscience and political communication and political psychology. This theory argues, on the basis of empirical research, that the trigger of any mobilization is anger, and the repressor is fear. Anger increases with the perception of an unjust action and with the identification of the agent responsible for the action. Economic crisis, I pay for it, the bankers did it. Fear triggers anxiety, which is experimentally associated with avoidance of danger. I'm anxious, I'm under the table. Fear is, however, overcome by sharing and identifying with others in the process of communicative action. Then, when fear is overcome, anger takes over, it leads to risk-taking behavior. Anger leads to risk-taking behavior. When the process of communicative action leads to collective action and change is ultimately enacted or a process of change unfolds, the most potent positive emotion prevails, enthusiasm, an emotion that powers purposive collective behavior for social change. So enthusiastic network individuals, having overcome fear, transform themselves then in a conscious collective actor. The social change comes from communicative action that involves connection between networks of neural networks from human brains stimulated by signals from a communication environment through communication networks. And the technology and morphology of these communication networks shapes the process of mobilization and therefore of social change, both as a process and as an outcome. And so which are these characteristics of the technology and morphology in the internet connections and how this relates to the process of current social movements? These movements, speaking now about the Arab revolutions, the Spanish movement, the Occupy Wall Street movement, and all the movements that we know empirically, share a number of key features in common. They are instant. They come out as a spark of indignation at one particular moment, unpredictable, uncontrollable. They are multimodal. Images in the network impact extraordinarily the minds and prompt mobilization. These networks are horizontal and selective, and therefore they are peer networks, P2P, okay? P2P. But in addition to share cool music, they share indignation and they share action and deliberation. They disintermediate formal leadership, the formal leadership that is affected by the legitimacy crisis, and therefore they are on their own and they stimulate cooperation and reciprocity. They are vital, they diffuse fast, they are expansive. They cannot be controlled because they have no center, and they reconfigure the networks endlessly. Technologically and organizationally, they are very difficult to suppress. When and if they reach legitimacy in society at large, which is the case of movements that I have presented here, police repression then starts. But this, in fact, strengthens the movement. Until now. This is not a general theory. This is what I have observed and analyzed until now. For instance, when in the Oakland repression, when the police dismantled after a night of battle the Occupy Oakland encampment in Oakland, California, when a Marine, Scott Olsen, a Marine of all people, was seriously injured and had a fracture of his skull, and is in very serious condition still, this immediately sparked outrage throughout the country, and the mayor of Oakland apologized, the movement in Oakland was re-energized, the Berkeley movement, which has been very subdued until then, started, etc. These movements are local and global at the same time. They always occupy a given space, they always have a local web, they are constantly in interaction, and the movement feed each other over global networks. They are self-reflective, they are constantly deliberating, constantly asking questions about themselves, about the society, about the crisis, like the Occupy London movement is doing at this point. They connect places and spatial networks with cyberspace and internet networks. They constantly create the dynamics between the space of places and the space of flows. So they form a public space. This is the most important thing. they have reconstructed a public space which is free and autonomous, both in the urban space and the cyberspace. At the same time, they cannot formalize any organization or leadership because their consensus depends on ad hoc deliberation and protest, not on programs or specific goals. Accordingly, they cannot focus on one task or project, as they cannot be channeled, and they cannot be channeled in political action that is instrumental, and they cannot be co-opted by political parties that are fully distrusted, although political parties, certain political parties, may profit from the changes in the public opinion created by the movement themselves. So, fundamentally, in my conceptual framework, there are social movements that aim at changing the values of society, but they also can be public opinion movements with strong impacts on elections. And in that sense, there are also political insurgency movements arguing for democracy and representation. But they are not programmatic and they are not instrumental. They aim at transforming the state, but not at seizing the state. They express feelings and stir debate, but do not create parties or support governments, although they are becoming, by the way, a target of choice for political marketing. The price of the indignado and of the occupier is going up fast. However, they are very political in a fundamental sense. This is when they propose and practice direct, deliberative democracy based on network democracy. This is a utopia of network democracy based on local communities and virtual communities in interaction. It's a utopia. But utopia is not something unexistent. It's not something that is crazy. A utopia is a mental construction. And utopias have a tremendous material force. Throughout history, utopias have driven history. Liberalism was a utopia. Socialism was a utopia. Communism was a utopia. Anarchism was a utopia. Even democracy was a utopia. It started as utopia before incarnated in all kinds of social practices that actually and ultimately transformed the world in different ways, not always in the way that the actors who were utopian wanted to, right? But it's a material force. It's not something marginal. A utopia is a material force. And so, to finish by saying that internet is a platform for autonomy. And when societies fail in managing their structural crisis by the existing institutions, change can only take place outside the system by a transformation of power relationships that start in people's minds and develops in the form of the networks built by the projects of new actors that aim at constituting themselves as the subjects of the new history in the making. Thank you very much.